Today at the ReConnection chat, we've got brother Nware Burge. So he's going to take us through, first we're going to speak about how to reconnect with our African descent, Afro-Descent brother and the Continental African brother. So we're going to see how we can reconnect together, we think we can do. And then also he's going to take us through some of his project. He did a lot of movies, a lot of documentary about culture. So he's gonna take us through all that. All right, so brother, welcome to the chat.
Yes. Peace and blessings to everybody out there. So my name is Nware Burge. But first and foremost, I want to say Happy Mother's Day to everybody out there, to your mothers. And I have to say, Happy Mother's Day for my mother, because and my father that brought me onto this journey as a person of African descent and who understands that as an African. But yes, my name is Nware Burge. I am a high school teacher in Newark, New Jersey, at a school called Lee Charter School. I also am a special education teacher. I have a bachelor's in liberal studies and minor in political science with a master's degree in education, and soon to be a PhD candidate, just waiting on a few things. But I'm also a filmmaker. So my film is called DNA, Using Genealogy to Change My Slave Last Name. And so I'm currently also an adjunct, before I get into the film, I'm also an adjunct professor at Keene University here in Union, New Jersey, which is about 10 minutes away, 15 minutes away from Newark. I'm in the interdisciplinary studies department, which is pretty much, humanities, culture, social sciences. I teach a course called Films of the African World Experience. So, and in that course, we pretty much have discourse around such films as like Daughters of the Dust, Confederate States of America, Goodbye Uncle Tom, Quilombo, which is Zumbi of Palmares, if anyone's familiar with Quilombo. 13th, 1804, A Great and Mighty Walk by Dr. John Henry Clark. And so I try to give my students a good understanding of African and African-American history through film and as well as the diaspora. So I open them up with Birth of a Nation. And, but even before Birth of a Nation, I open them up with like a documentary on the Kushite Empire. So I kind of bring them in from kind of like the origins and then into the diaspora and of course into the Americas. And so it's very, very important to understand, our history and culture and from which we originated. I see my cousin Marcy there. How are you, Marcy?
Fine.
All right. And my cousin's out in LA too. So for the brother who's in LA, my cousin Marcy, she's out in LA too. All right, Anaheim area. But going back to the film course, I open up with Osameni Simbeni, who is the father of African film. And I show a film called Black Girl, and then Oscar Michaud, his film Within Our Gates. And so when I said I opened with Birth of a Nation, or the Kushite Empire first, but then I go to Birth of a Nation. to kind of show this kind of polar opposite of our history and our culture here, as people of African descent, where we come from this, this great lineage, but here you have the first films that perpetuates and creates this narrative of people of African descent being the other. So that film, the counter to that film is a film called Within Our Gates. And so if you never saw it, it's because everyone often talks about Birth of a Nation, but Oscar Micheaux, who was one of the father of African American cinema, considered the father, is the counter to that film. And so all the negatives, if you're familiar with Birth of a Nation, and those who aren't, it pretty much is I'll put it like this, the Ku Klux Klan, the white racist terrorist group here in America, is the heroes of the film, if you will. And so the film takes place during Reconstruction. And I don't want to go into a whole history lesson in regards to Reconstruction, but people of African descent, African Americans, are 40, 50 years out of so-called emancipation and are now establishing themselves as citizens here in America and establishing themselves economically throughout America. And as they are establishing themselves and beginning to purchase property, because all we had was us at that time, you now have the inception of the Ku Klux Klan to create terror, to actually, keep us from, to scare us off of this property. Case in point, to the brother who's in LA, my cousin who's in LA, I was just filming at Bruce's Beach a few weeks ago, Manhattan Beach, and it was a beach that was bought by African Americans in the early 19th century. And eventually the Ku Klux Klan and white terrorists took the property. And so
they just got it back from what I heard.
Yes, exactly. And so I was lucky enough to be there because I planned this out. And I'm going to go into that a little later in regards to the projects I'm working on. But it just so happened while I was out there, they made the pronouncement, and lo and behold, they do this whole reclamation for reparations for the Bruce family. And so for those in the diaspora who aren't familiar, African Americans had established economic bases heavily here throughout the states around America, but a lot of the economic base, meaning the institutions, schools, banks, you could say even places of leisure, cleaners, library. These things were actually taken away from African Americans. And now, as we are still struggling economically here, many times the discussion about the riots that happened in the early 19th centuries that disenfranchised African Americans from for a lot of the economic bases that we had. We often talk about the 1960s riots and we never talk about the 1920s riot. And so many around the world will understand Dr. King was killed, Malcolm X was killed, Kennedy was killed, and all these things happened in the 1960s that were disenfranchising Blacks as they fought for civil rights. But the 1920s, that needs to take a more of a critical lens. My film DNA actually won Best Documentary in Accra, Ghana, but I'm just gonna give a backstory. So I'm not a quote unquote filmmaker per se, as in how many filmmakers may go to an institution or a school with an MFA, what's called Masters of Fine Arts. And so what I did was, in my interest in film, I took a film class, a local film class in the city of Philadelphia here in America. And it was like a 12-week film class. So I didn't know how to use a camera. I didn't know how to use editing software. I didn't know anything. And you pay a fee for this course, and it teaches you how to use the software and the camera. And then after 12 weeks, you are to put together like a 15-minute film. So I give thanks to a place called Scribe Media Center in Philadelphia, where again, anyone literally from off the street, meaning like any local person, you don't have to have, you know, bachelor's degrees and all this stuff and diplomas, none of that stuff. You just come in and just take a class and learn to use the camera. And so you have like a cohort of 12 people and everyone works on each other's project. And at the very end, like I said earlier, you're supposed to have a 15-minute project. And so Scribe Media Center, which was run by Louis Messiah, and my teacher was Alex Marte, and a friend of mine by the name of Sister Jennifer actually told me about this film school. And I went with a friend of mine, very close friend of mine, Yamani Oju, who we were going to an event, and then she told me about this school where you could take a class. And lo and behold, after 12 weeks, I put together, my piece was about 35 minutes, and the teacher let me go, you know, over that 15-minute threshold or that time frame that they had. And it was about 8 of us or 9 of us that each had projects, and so as they showed each project, they saved mine for last because it was the longest. And at the end of the film screening that we had, the very end of that film screening, after the 12-week program, a few people came to me and said, "Hey, this looks like a documentary that I might see on one of the stations, like a BBS or a BBC or a PBS." And I said, "Thank you." And they said, "Do you ever consider putting it in film festivals?" And I said, "Well, can you tell me more about it?" Because again, I didn't know too much about this. And when I went to Google film festivals and they gave me information, it has to be about 45 minutes. And so I figured out a way to add time to my film and decided to put it into the festivals. And I think a few festivals rejected it, but the festival that accepted it was the Black Star International Film Festival in Accra, Ghana, that they have every year. I think it's been running for about 5 years. And so I was very, very happy, elated. I was like, look, someone accepted my film. I was so happy. And then about 3 weeks later, they sent another email stating that, "Hey, you won Best Documentary for this film, and will you be coming to get the award in person?" And at that point, I just couldn't believe it because, again, in my mind, I wasn't a filmmaker. I was just putting together a project of these ideas that I had. And so, you know, I'll get to why I made the film. So again, the name of the film is called DNA, Using Genealogy to Change My Slave Last Name. And originally, for those who don't know, African Americans, we have our last names or surnames were given from the slave master, whoever owned us. So of course, over time, people were married, but the enslavement period here in America lasted, you know, 300 to 400 years or more. People debate and argue the time frames of when we first got here. And then there's a whole other history around being indentured servants first, and as opposed to chattel slavery when it began. We can get in, you know, people have different understandings of that. But in regards to the history, Blacks were named, our last names were given by the slave master. And so we carry the last names of mine, Burge, or Lovett. My mother's last name is Lovett. My father's last name is Burge. O'Neill, Jenkins, Johnson, Wilson, Smith, Jackson. We can go on, and these are all English names. And so for me, growing up, and when I talked about my mother, my father, they were very, you know, as they say, Afrocentric or African-centered, understanding that we come from Africa, and Africa is our home. For many African Americans, that's a discussion and a debate, and that some believe, hey, we're totally different person here. We come from there, and then you have some now stating that we were already here, which is a different type of information that I understand, but I don't want to take that left turn. But having said that, for me, with my mother and father, giving me this information growing up, as a kid, I didn't really understand all of this stuff. But when I got older and began to read, and if we understand, like our scholars like Dr. John Henrik Clarke and Dr. Ben Yakinen, Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, and the ISIS papers, and Amos Wilson, the Blueprint for Black Power, and I can go on and on. You can go on and on. And as I'm reading in my late teens and early 20s, I'm starting to understand this culture of who we are and where we come from. And so then I begin to question everything. Like, well, if understanding, for example, Maulana Karenga, who created Kwanzaa, this reconnecting to the continent, how and why we should reconnect ourselves, socially, spiritually, and mentally. And the creation of Kwanzaa from Maulana Karenga, he created, and I don't want to get into his history, but the idea more or less comes from, totally connecting. So and Karenga talked about speaking Kiswahili and learning languages. And, as I'm reading all this stuff and learning about all this stuff, I'm like, well, why are we practicing, if we now know these histories, then why are we practicing European religion? Why are we speaking their language? Why are we carrying their names? Why are we dressing like this? Was all these things that went on in my head. Why are we following these people that have oppressed us? And then as I got older, I began to understand this is not everyone's journey. And when we understand racism, white supremacy, and imperialism, colonization, acculturation, all these things that we talk about in sociology and social sciences, then it all begins to make sense. If you haven't studied or read these things, and you may not be, and I'm not saying the audience, I'm saying anyone in general, like myself, we don't understand these connections. But it was always a question to me, why are we following with people who oppressed us so bad, killed, murdered, raped, pillaged, and on the continent and here in America, why are we even following anything that they're doing? Why are we even speaking English? So these were all the things that went on. And so the idea of the film kind of comes out of, I just didn't want to, I respect and love my, the last name Lovett, my mother, and Burge. But again, that name takes us back to Europe. And we're one of the only peoples in the world. There's other discussions around Asian culture and stuff like that, where our surname isn't a map for us or an address. For example, a close friend of mine, Neil Bladi Odayo Jogo Otu, a high school friend of mine, he always says, hey, Otu. If I say Otu, I know that's almost like an address in Accra, or so and we have those type of discussions of understanding the name and the history and the lineage. And so again, Burge takes me directly to Germanic region of Europe. And so so if we're naming ourselves, a lot of times African Americans will give our first names so that it won't be a John or a Mary, for example, which is my mother's first name, right? And we know these are biblical names, but a lot of Black people feel like names like Tom and Diane are quote unquote white names, and we'll give ourselves names like, 4-syllable names like Quanisha, 3 syllables, that mimic Arabic or African sounding names. To take pride in our culture, we'll just make them up, and we'll take pride in that first name, never thinking that we're carrying the last name for generations, forever. So that's why it kind of resonated with me, not only because of the history of studying and research and stuff like that, and personal history of study of history, but if we're taking pride in all this new first names that we've done in the 70s, like a Shaquille O'Neal, for example, where his mother named him Shaquille, but O'Neal is Irish, and he's one of the biggest Black African Americans that you ever want to see, and his last name is O'Neal. So, which doesn't make, to me, any sense. So, so that's where this film kind of is born out of. And so, Dr. Gina Page of AfricanAncestry.com, if anyone's familiar, there's a sister who does genetic ancestry research. And so you have genealogy, where you're studying the study of your parents and your family and that. Then you have genetic testing, blood testing. And so for me, I thought to myself, well, if this genetic testing is used to free people, because you have people who, oh, I don't trust that DNA, but if you're locked up in jail for 40 years and they say you could take a DNA test, you're not going to stay in jail for another, for that time and tell people that you don't trust DNA. Now I understand people don't trust what the government is doing and those things. I'm 100% agree with them. But Dr. Page talks about, specifically as a Black company, what she does with the DNA. And then there's other arguments about different versions of it and what should be used and what's accurate or not. Again, I've had these discussions, and again, I don't want to take it again left. So I just decided, hey, if we're using it to find out excavation of and claiming our lineage to Nubia through DNA and anthropology and archaeology, and we're using DNA for all these reasons, why not have it for our names? And so of course we won't be able to go directly back to the direct ancestor, but you have a region, and why not, okay, go from that region, and you can go from there. And again, it's not to dismiss or discourage or disrespect people who religiously may, who become a part of the Ifa traditions, Yoruba traditions, Hebrew Israelite, Nation Islam or Islamic, and take a name after their spiritual system. I'm not disrespecting that, and I don't disagree with that. I'm just adding to the narrative of, hey, this is bloodlines, this is who we are. Why not, take on a name of who you are genetically, like, so, and understanding, like, for example, like if you see a case here, like in Ifa, again, Ifa traditions, you'll take on a name, and like I said, that as stated a second ago. So I'm pretty much coming from that type of framework around that. Now, within the film, the reasons, a couple of reasons for the film, other reasons was I was taking a master's degree class, and if anyone understands what etymology is the study of names, right? In this master's degree class, the professor was doing what's called an icebreaker. An icebreaker here in the States is when you start a job or in the class, each person is to say their name, where they're from, to introduce yourself to everybody. So everybody is to do that. So you say your name, why you're taking a class, or what it is that you do, and then the next person goes. And so in this class, the professor was white. And what he did was, or what he didn't notice, or maybe he did, when a Black person or when a white person said their name, for example, we say, hey, my name's John Szynski, I'm taking this class because I need it for XYZ. And he would be like, oh, Szynski, the ski is a Polish name. And then he would give the etymology and history of the name. And so what I noticed was when the Black people was going, he wasn't doing that. So if I say, hey, my name is John Jackson, I'm from Detroit, I'm taking this class because he said, oh, well, how's Detroit, John, or whatever. And it wasn't until either when I left class or either the next day that it dawned on me that he wasn't doing the etymology of Black people, only the white people in the class. And I don't know if he knew that. And so it hit me like, oh, I know why, because he clearly understands that African Americans and Caribbean Americans, Caribbean people, have the surnames of people from England, Portugal, France, as Haitians, et cetera, et cetera. But we take pride in that. And so, and that's one of the reasons. It was kind of like the elephant in the room that no one I don't know if anyone, even thought about that. One of the other reasons, though, which is the center of the film, is the film. I play basketball, and so you'll see a little bit of that for anyone who's watched the film. And so when I was, I think, in 8th or 9th grade, I'm watching this women's basketball team, and they're playing each other, and there's these twins named the Burge twins, same last name, Burge, and they're very good basketball players. And I called my mother and I said, Mom, come here quick. These white girls, they got my name, Ma. And so she comes in, and I'm watching the game, and she looks, and ironically, one of them's about to shoot what's called a free throw, and they put the name there, and then she looks at me, looks back at the television, looks back at me, and said, "No, Nware, they don't have your name, you have their name. That they may have been your slave masters, ancestors, owners or something, but you have their name." And I'm young, and so I kind of didn't understand that so much, as being 12, 13, 14. And so that is sort of the center of the film. But the premise of the film is, of course, the DNA genetics and connecting, but also reconnecting mentally, spiritually, and physically back to the continent on different levels. And so that's sort of the root. And so in the film is, again, Dr. Gina Page, who's the president and co-founder. Dr. Rick Kittles from LA is also part of what's called AfricanAncestry.com. So Dr. Gina Page is in the film. Dr. Leonard Jeffries, who's a universal international scholar of African studies and elder, who I believe is in his 80s, he's in the film. Dr. James Peterson, a close friend of mine that I grew up with, was a professor. Senator Parker, a state senator who is from Brooklyn, but was an African American history professor and African studies professor. The Brown family of the Egbe Ijoba. And so, it was pretty much, a collaboration of, me, speaking to people, and then, having these discussions. And then a brother by the name of Tazariak, who is a Hebrew Israelite. And he changed his name for the sake of his religion, which originally was what the film was supposed to be about. It was supposed to be about, not the film, but my idea was supposed to be about these Black religions and the origins of them, as for the deity to not be white, right? So there's a consciousness amongst a lot of Black people and African Americans, and in Caribbean Americans, who understand that we've been given this image of a white God or white deity or whatever, and you have a lot of systems, for example, with Rastafarian culture, who don't follow or subscribe to the ideology of a white deity. So, and there are other sects, and so that's originally what the film was supposed to be about. But then I did the film on names, and then now I am working on that project and other projects now. And so that's pretty much like a lot of what I'm, dual citizenship as part of what the idea is, again, to kind of collaborate with our brothers and sisters. And so the title was funny because I was going to give, I think, the name of the film like some kind of academic title or something. I was going to call it like in post-colonial Western society, should African American, indigenous to West Africa continue to carry European surnames? Kind of academic, this kind of thing, whatever. And when I thought about it, I was like, let me just call it DNA. And the premise would be, should Black people change their white last name? As simple as that. It's right to the point. Should Black people change their white last name? Because again, in the Americas, for those who aren't aware, we carry the last names of of white people, proudly actually. So, so that, I think for me, is kind of the premise or the base, I think, of the film. And I feel like if we're going to go in these directions, I was able to speak with Dr. Obadeli Cambone in Accra, Ghana, and meet with him and talk to him and spend a whole day with him, interviewed him and stuff. Very brother, I think he's from Chicago or Atlanta, I'm not sure, but who and a school chief, I believe, in Ghana, speaks several languages, teaches, Twi and different languages, pre-colonial languages. Like he is, he's something else. And but when we had this conversation, he was saying, like, there's a lot of what's called ethnocentrism, or, I don't want to say tribalism, but where, different ethnic groups around the continent, or West Africa specifically. He said that could be sort of a divisive kind of thing in doing that. And I didn't agree with him at that time, but later I began to understand that where he was coming from in moving as a, because we're not monolithic, meaning we're not just one African group. We know that we have hundreds of languages, and even the tongue that we have here in America, as they call it, Ebonics, is a pidgin, believe it or not, from studies of certain words that we say, which comes out of West Africa linguistically. Whether even when the patois is spoken in the Caribbean, in Haiti and in Jamaica, which isn't specifically patois, but that's just the overall name of that. But what Dr. Cambone was saying is, under racism and white supremacy, we need to understand it doesn't matter the name you give yourself or whatever ethnic group. It's like, under this thing that we've been in, colonialism and imperialism, we have to stop the divisiveness that's going on. And so here in America, we have something like, ADOS going on, descendants of slaves, and, for reasons of reparations, which, I understand these things. I know genetically who we are. I'm clear on that. And there's a lot of, again, rhetoric and changes on where people stand with that. But, but again, this comes from, me with my personal journey. Again, with, when I talked about, They Came Before Columbus by Dr. Ivan Van Sertima and Yoruba by Marin Banini's different books, and reading Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey. And for those who may not be aware, Marcus Garvey was centered in repatriating to Africa, which is rooted in Rastafarian culture. Rastafarians talk about repatriation, even if it's not physically going, mentally being an understanding that you are from the continent. And they view Marcus Garvey, of course, Haile Selassie, but Marcus Garvey as a prophet type of person. And then there's another story for people who understand that too. But he's, reading the Philosophy and Opinions gives you more of a base, especially when you're reading it at a younger age, of mentally and spiritually connecting yourself to the continent. And again, this is not something that many Black people think. That what I've noticed over time, it's a very small percentage of people who have these type of viewpoints. And my theory on that is a majority of the world is working class society. Majority of the world works. Much of the world doesn't. It isn't just reading. All of these. Books about even British history. For those from London who's familiar with Brother Kehinde Andrews, and he's talking about retelling of Black radicalism. These type of things that give us insight and foresight to us being of African descent. That's just not across the board. And so I think that this is something that we need to really think hard and consider like, how do we now connect? Now, some of the projects that I'm working on currently, I talked about the first film, DNA. And so I'm currently working on DNA Part 2, Igbo Landing, which is the name, because matrilineal, so when you do your DNA genetics, you do what's called matrilineal, which is mother side, patrilineal, which is father side. There's something called autosomal, which is I believe all encompassing. And again, I'm not a geneticist. I speak to people who are, but the autosomal, for what they say, is all encompassing. But matrilineal, I am, when I got my results, I'm 100%, as they say, 100% Igbo from Nigeria. And now, again, we understand how there was a lot of migrations on the continent, et cetera, et cetera. But my results were 100% Igbo. And so what Igbo Landing is, there's a society called the Gullah Geechee Nation in the southeast in America, which has retained a lot of their African heritage and culture. And so there's a story about the Igbo. If anyone knows the Black Panther movie, at the very end, when Killmonger makes a speech about when he's stabbed by T'Challa the King, and then he doesn't want to go and be put in bondage, and he makes this statement. He's referring to there's a film called Daughters of the Dust that talks about the Igbo who were brought to South Carolina area, North Carolina, South Carolina, the coastal area, that refused to be enslaved, and they walked into the water. And for those who know the history of the transatlantic slave trade, there was a lot of, I don't even know if we should call it suicide, because they felt as though they were going home. And so, so I decided, because I'm 100% Igbo, to call it DNA Part 2, Igbo Landing. The other film I'm working on is called, again, Our God is Black, which will talk about the Black spiritual systems that were kind of born out of, I don't want to say the Black arts movement in the 60s, but because these systems have been around for centuries, when you talk to people, but as they were, maybe I want to say, for lack of a better term, redesigned for, as African Americans and Caribbean people, brought a certain consciousness of to not praise a white god or white deity. There were different sects of religions that come out of this, and different spiritual systems come out of this. So I talk about, in this film, it'll be about the people who follow the Kemetic, Egyptian Kemetic traditions, Hebrew Israelite traditions, the Nation of Islam. And then here in America, there's an offshoot of the Nation of Islam called the 5% Nation, the Nation of Gods and Earths, which played a major role in the hip hop of the 90s. And, you know, I said Rastafarians also, but also E5 people here, African Americans, who are following Akan traditional cultures, E5 Yoruba culture, spiritually and in their lives. And so I wanted to do or what I'm working on is an all-encompassing thing, talking about a lot of the positives. Rasta culture, for a lot of people who's eating, you know, sea moss and a lot of these things, Rastas have been talking about sea moss forever. Healthy meditations, Kemetic societies, been around for about 30, 40 years. They've been at the forefront of that. Positive affirmations, like, you know, here in America, a lot of Blacks use the N-word a lot, you know, B-word, you know, negative words. And so in these systems, like Nation of Gods and Earth will say peace. That's when we say peace, it comes from Nation of Gods and Earth. So, or Peace King, or Empress, like the Rastas, these positive affirmations, or Hotep. You know, all of these great things, you know, African centered schools like Shoelace, or Ron Nefer Amen, who wrote a book called The Meadow Netter, deciphering the hieroglyphics in Egyptian writing, created a school called Kemetic Preparatory Institute. And so all of these great things that these African-centered circles are doing, I want to bring to the forefront in this film. One of the other films I'm working on is called Black Beaches, beach property that Blacks owned all around America. And so earlier, if you were on earlier in the early 1920s, again, you had, you always had tyranny against Black people from white people here in America since we got here. And so for those who aren't aware, none of this is new with George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery or Breonna Taylor or anybody. None of this is new. Will Smith made a great comment where he said, you know, racism it has always been around. It's just being filmed now. You're seeing it now. So, but this tyranny that we've been in the early 1920s, again, that specific time, there was something called the Red Summer, Red Riots, and I talked about that earlier. But we lost a lot of property, and I'm going to be focusing more on the beachfront property where Black people kind of conveyed. There was something called the Green Book, and for those who aren't aware, there was in the early 19th century when Blacks began to, when cars were manufactured and created, and Blacks began to drive and travel around America, you needed this book so that you won't get killed. You know, simple as that. You know, you can go to a gas station and be killed. You go to a place of rest to eat or to a rest room and be killed. So you had to know where you can go and where you couldn't go. And so that what's called the Green Book, the Black beaches is sort of a part of that, where Black people could go and have a safe space, almost as if, where I'm going to tie it into maroon societies, for those who are familiar with maroons and what maroon societies are. These were people who escaped off of the plantations and created settlements and safe enclave, and would go back and grab their, and then there's discussions around grabbing. I won't get into what happened, some historical things that happened during marooning, but Black beaches is sort of a maroon society type of thing, if you will. Now, you did have a lot of upwardly mobile Blacks that, you know, had these properties, but it was a safe place for a lot of popular Joe Louis, famous boxers, to go and hang out and have a safe place to be without the pressure of white America and white society. And so Black Beaches is going to talk about Manhattan Beach in LA, especially what's going on there with the reparations. Sag Harbor, Azarest, that's in the Hamptons and Long Island. Amelia Beach down in Jacksonville, Florida. Atlantic Beach in South Carolina. Highland Beach in Maryland, which is Frederick Douglass's children went to buy land and was rejected. There's a whole story around that, but they were able to establish land there, a beach property there. Idlewild, which isn't necessarily a beach, but a leisure area around water, and of course Martha's Vineyard. And so it's going to encompass, and there's a whole bunch of others like Chicken Bone Beach here in New Jersey and Atlantic City. And so, you know, you had a lot of riots that happened on the beach. You know, Black people just trying to go hang out. And here we go again, you know, white people just making it difficult for Blacks to be able to just have leisure time. And so again, you know, I'll probably show, you know, a good 2 minutes, if you will, of each piece, so you guys can see it, so everyone can see it. But, you know, so those are some of the things that I'm working on. And in regards to the interconnection of what we're talking about, Africans and African Americans, and how can we, other ideas that people may have to create this bridge and this fallacy of, you know, we have these names for each other, and, you know, this disrespect that goes on. You know, you have issues of that, but we understand that you know, when we go to the continent, you know, there's a lot of love for us when we go there. And whatever little issues that people have had personally, nuances, whatever, everyone has those issues. So, but another project that I'm working on is called African Athletes in America. And there's a brother that I'm very busy, but me and his brother, I always tell him, look, this month or next month, we're gonna film. So I'm gonna be like, for example, playing basketball one-on-one with Africans, continental Africans that are here in America, who could be from Senegal, Ghana, Nigeria, whatever. What was your experience like? Well, you know, what's your name? What's your ethnic group? What was your experience like when you first got here? What was some of the dynamics with African Americans, both positive and negative? What were some of the things that the food you liked or didn't like? You know, just telling the story around, you know, this kind of, I could say, just learning each other, learning from each other, and learning each other, because it's not enough of it. And so I might play them one-on-one to 5. I'm a little older, I'm 50 years old. So, you know, I don't know if I'll be able to keep up with some of these brothers and sisters, but, you know, that's pretty much gonna be the premise. You know, we'll play a one-on-one, but have dialogue about, you know, jollof rice and fufu or whatever, you know, or what did you think when you tasted grits? Or do you know what grits are? You know, like, you know, these, you know, elements that can be bridge building dialogue, you know, within sports. And so I'm hoping to, you know, I can maybe interview football players, other soccer players, whatever, but athletes that are here in the States, and their experiences and their acculturation into quote unquote African-American or Black society, or if you will, debates that you may have had with your parents about that. You know, we know some of the stories and some of the things that parents from the continent may tell their kids who are here in regards to relationships with African Americans. So, you know, just beginning to have this discussion. It's not to leave out Caribbean Americans who are all encompassing and a part of the diaspora, but specifically my film, and this is more or less specifically about the reconnection to the continent, building the bridges. And again, this is not for those who disagree, for those who say, hey, we're not from Africa, we don't, why are we even going over there? What, you know, this ain't even for them or that. You know, I have some friends who were over in Sierra Leone, they just had their independence. They just got citizenship, dual citizenship. So this is part of what my projects are about. And so if, you know, I know I've been talking pretty much for an hour. I'm gonna try to share the screen and show a bit of what I've been working on, if that's cool. I'm looking at, wow, he's doing a lot of great things. I'm reading the messages. Thank you, Avanti Hall. I appreciate you and appreciate that. I'm hoping through my, if I begin a thesis and PhD, to be able to use, you know, this kind of critical inquiry, engaging in intellectual dialogue with, you know, with facts and primary evidence and textual evidence and stuff in, you know, that I'll put in films and stuff like that. So that interdisciplinary research and stuff is very important, and having primary evidence, not facts, but evidence is important. So I'm going to try to, you know, work this thing here. Bear with me for those who are here. Hit the share screen. Let me, and if anything happens and this thing pops off, I'm gonna hop on the another camera that I have, or another computer that I have available. So, Vimeo. All right. Hopefully this comes up.
Puisque on ne vient pas, voilà.
All right, just give me a sec here, working with this. Here we go. Slow motion. And it was working earlier when we had these preliminaries with sorry, weird thing happening. Okay, we're gonna try. Here.
I mean, that's a lot of things you actually doing. So how do you manage to get the time to do all that?
Oh yeah, I know, right? I just pushed through, man. I teach, you know, in high school and college, and I can't see. I need to turn this other one on because I can't see you guys. But in high school and college, you have spring breaks, summer breaks. Like we have like June, end of June, July, and August off. So I spend that time filming. Weekends, we're off filming. You know, if I have time at night, you know, or whatever time I get, calling, making appointments and stuff like that. So, so yeah, so that's pretty much what it is that I try to do in my off time. So the filming, and so I'm hoping, you know, to do a like a GoFundMe and a Kickstarter to really start my film company over the summer. And for all those who know, I just turned 50. I'm having a Royal African Garb 50th celebration / launch of my film company. Everyone's invited, no matter where you're from. Hopefully it'll be in August. I'll let everybody know. But all African garbs and drumming and Afrobeat and house music. If everything works out right, it's going to be a great. We're going to have a lot of fun.